Perfect. Right. Well, welcome everyone to the session 8B. We've got 3 papers this morning, really interesting papers. We are starting a little bit late, but we're going to make sure that we have a fair amount of time for all 3 papers. It might squeeze the discussion at the end, but take it into coffee or find other ways to communicate with the paper presenters. The 3 papers are going to be Jan Bang, Jenny Pickerill, who's online, and Amsale Temesgen, who's here in the room. So we're going to be moving back and forth a little bit. Jan is going to make a short presentation and then include discussion. He's got 30 minutes. He knows I'm keeping strict time because in fairness to others. Jan grew up in England and has lived 25 years in kibbutz and Camp Hill communities in Israel and Norway. He is the author of 7 books on eco-villages. I've read several of them myself. And he's been involved with ICSA from the very beginning in 1985. So we've got a true guru on our hands. And I'm going to hand over to you, Jan, and you can take it from here.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Is this working? Am I on? Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, so I was going to do a little introduction, but I don't need to. It's great. It's already been done for me. I love it when people do things for me. So can eco-villages save the world? The answer is yes. Okay, so we can go on to the next presentation now. I wanted to be a bit provocative because actually I'm not here as an academic who has researched something and come to some amazing scientific conclusion, and I'm going to present it and defend it. I'm actually asking the question because it's something that's been in my head, and I'm not actually an academic. I barely got a degree. I'm not a researcher, really. I sometimes call myself a researcher, but that means I just go and look at communities. I don't really have the research tools. And I'm a little concerned that maybe I'm deluded. Maybe it's a weird fantasy, because I actually do believe that eco-villages can save the world. And I'm wondering how come we didn't do it already, actually. But having read a lot about the past of communities, what I want to do is to set the stage for a discussion. And so instead of me presenting you with a thesis and you ask me questions, it's the other way around. I want to set a stage where you ask me questions. Okay, because when I give answers, I learn. Actually, I don't learn so much from putting a question. I learn more from hearing the answers. So I'm going to try and do, can we put this up? Oh, great, it works. Wow, that's amazing. Technology is great. So I'm going to try and do 2,500 years of history in 10 minutes. Okay, so it's going to go pretty fast. So I want you really to hang in there, especially around the bends. You really got to hold on tight, and we'll see if we can go from 2,500 years ago. So is it a good idea if I just say next slide? Is that the best way of doing it? Yeah. Next slide. So the first indication we have of eco-villages or intentional community, which I find is a better word because it also includes those villages that are not ecological, but are working on maybe human relationships or other things, is way back from a person that we don't actually have any of his writings, a guy called Pythagoras. We only really know about him from other people talking about him. And you know what it's like when other people talk about somebody. So this is in the mists of time. These are the legends and myths of intentional community. And Pythagoras is well known for the stuff, he's the guy in the middle here, from these formula, because he did geometry and amazing stuff. I mean, we could have a whole session just on that. But he also took a group of his followers from Greece to southern Italy and set up an intentional community. So read about it. It's fascinating. They did all kinds of, maybe they were vegetarians, some people said. Women had nearly equal rights. I mean, radical stuff. They didn't last very long, but their effects have come through history for a long time. What's really interesting that about 50 years later, the guy on the left here, Plato, wrote the Republic, which is, I think, the first utopian account we have. In other words, here were two people, one was doing intentional community, and the other person was writing about intentional community. And this is the first indication we have. I could have the next slide. If I go forward now, or towards our era, by about 500 years, we find an intentional community in the desert in Qumran, the Jordan Valley, called the Essenes. Now, we know about those guys because we've actually, I've walked through their rooms. They've been excavated. We have their texts. And we have some indications that a guy that's quite well known through history, a guy called Jesus, we think he may have been one of them. And it's almost certain that his buddy, John the Baptist, was one of them. So here's an intentional community, if that's correct, that's had immense influence on the world history. Next, please. Next slide. And one of those influences was that they started the Western tradition of monasticism as we know it today. Now, the interesting thing here is that in the first few hundred years, the Christian church was a minority, underground, alternative. They were like, freaks. The Romans didn't like them much. They killed a lot of them and stuff. And then it became a state religion. Now, of course, you think, wow, that's great, when Ecovillages will become a state religion. But what happened was power corrupts. And there's been a very unfortunate history of corruption. At the same time as they became a state church, monasticism started, like an alternative movement. Let's go back out into the wilderness and form little communities and do real Christianity. And this monastic tradition is still with us today. It's very strong. And not only in monasteries, but I came across a group of weird hippie freaks in Wales in 1980 who had the rule of Benedict as their kind of way of living together. They didn't last very long, but the fact is they looked to Benedict, to the rules of monasticism. Can I have the next slide, please? So in the traditions that I know, boy, that's pretty good. We've done the first 1,000 years. Actually, more than that. There was a lot of tension between the established Christianity and alternative forms of Christianity. Somebody one day will write, a book of the crisis between capitalism and alternatives to capitalism, and this resulted in this time, 1400s, resulted in a lot of Christians thinking that the Catholic Church was really not there at all. This is not. We don't want this stuff. And they started forming alternatives. Tabor was, as far as I know, the first city in Europe to become a collective. They were established by, get this, by the Taborites. Well, that's pretty good. That's good naming. They had no money. All things were held in common. We kibbutzniks, we remember that. All things are held in common in kibbutz. They had no private ownership of houses. Well, I remember that from the kibbutz I lived in. They were even more, for a while, they had no marriage. I don't know quite how that squared with some of the Christian values that I know about, but they had a certain amount of freedom in that sphere. They didn't last very long. But next slide, please. I'm trying to remember which slide it is. Yeah. So they started a movement called the United Brothers, Unitas Fratrum, I think it was, which was a number of small congregations of Christians, very pious, no hierarchical structure. Their structure was to sit together and pray or just sit in silence or talk. And this is a very interesting space, because they were in Hungary, what's today's Czech Republic, Eastern Europe, which was a border country where the rules of the Catholic Church didn't really apply that much. It was the frontier of Europe, and groups of people disappeared into the forest there to live their lives and do their thing. They were more or less allowed to do that. And they lasted for, they formed these small communities, and we're going to hear more about their descendants in the next slide. Amos Comenius, by the way, was an educator who's still relevant today. And anybody from Camp Hill will recognize him because he's one of the inspirators of Camp Hill. If we go to England, we have Gerard Winstanley during the English Civil War formed a commune on St. George's Hill, just outside London, which lasted 2 years, I think. It doesn't seem very significant, but the name has gone on in the communities movement. So in Haight-Ashbury, in 1962, I think it was, somebody set up the Diggers' Kitchen, I think it was called. It was food for the people who were damaged by drugs and other things, so that they would have something to eat. And in England, in 1968, Sid Rawls started the London Diggers. What they did was they went and occupied houses that were not being used. And today, there is a Diggers and Dreamers directory that comes out of the British Communes movement every few years. Now, the idea from 1649 is still alive. That, for me, is absolutely fascinating. Give me the next slide, please. Little aside there. Let's go back to Eastern Europe again. The Moravian church, called the Herrenhutters, was started by this guy Zinzendorf. He was an aristocrat. And one day, it was very idealistic. One day, this guy arrived from the forests and said, I'm a descendant of the United Brothers, and we have a congregation that has nowhere to live. Can we come and live on your estate? Look it up for the complete story. It's fascinating. They started this village called Herrenhut, which means the outlook of the Lord. And they are still active today. Interestingly, they're very Christian, but they don't do missionary stuff. They go out and start things like hospitals and schools. And if anybody asks what inspires them, they say, well, we pray to the Lord. If you want to join us, that's fine. If you don't want to join us, that's fine too. That's the kind of missionary activity I like to see, actually. And anybody who knows about Camp Hill will recognize this guy also, because he's one of the inspirators of Camp Hill. Can we have the next slide, please? Now we're getting up towards the industrial time. And I'm hoping you're seeing there's a kind of pattern emerging here. Social unrest, what happens? Small groups of people set up alternative communities, intentional communities, and their effect lasts for hundreds of years. Getting that pattern? Great. So Robert Owen, Welsh industrialist, he set up New Lanark, which is the picture on the left here, a factory complex with workers' houses in Scotland. People here who have been involved in this movement of ICSA for a long time, they will know about that. And the Camp Hill people will also know about that because we've had conferences there. Just one thing about Owen I want to say is that he was a great educator. And I love to quote him when he said that we should set up schools for children and don't bother them with books. I think, wow, that's so great. And it's actually reflected in the Steiner School movement, where there are no textbooks. There are actually, but they're very few. And the kids write their own books. So he's also somebody who's very important in the cooperative movement, and his idea set up the first cooperative movement, which I think today is one of the largest international movements in the world, cooperative banks, shops, and so on. He also set up something called New Harmony, and actually one of the founders of the ICSA is an expert on New Harmony. Okay, let's have the next slide. I'm going much too slowly here, but you're hanging in there, right? Okay, so a few years ago, 2004, ICSA had its conference at Amana Village in Iowa, in the middle of America. They were one of these people, one of these sets of people who were kind of refugees from those Eastern European weirdos, those Christian pietists with no priests and no structure, but they sat together and prayed. And they set up this place here in the 1880s, I think it was. And it was a flourishing collective village, no private property. They did have marriage. It wasn't that exciting, you know, but they had no money. They ate in dining halls. And then in 1923 or something, I think it was, they privatized, but they're still there. You know, you can go there. If you scratch the surface, they're all still there. The ideas, the feeling of this. And I have a very personal attachment to this because we went there and I sat in their graveyard and I realized that, yes, communities live on after they die. That was great. And I wrote a book about that, actually. Next slide, yeah. It's out of print, but it's not that great. I thought it was great. The Bruderhof is another one of these guys, remnants from those Eastern European people. Actually, the Bruderhof was set up in Germany in 1923, I think it was. But they were inspired by those other ideas. And they have a great history. You read their history. This is exciting stuff, like moving whole communities from Germany to England, from England to Paraguay, from Paraguay to the United States. I think there are now 30-something Bruderhof communities in I don't know how many countries, continents, a thriving community, no money, no private property, eating in dining halls. For a while, they were very, actually quite wealthy as a community. For a while, they had their own aeroplane. Oh, I could tell you stories about this stuff. But they do lots of peace work, lots of work with human rights. They work very, very intensively with people on death row. They're dead against the, killing people. So they work with those people who are sitting on death row. Still going strong. Let's go on to the next slide. We must be getting closer now. Ah, kibbutz. You can't say anything without kibbutz, right? So I just have to show you this. This is the first kibbutz. Actually, it's an iconic picture. We all know this picture, right? She's not here. This is kibbutz Lotan, an eco-village kibbutz in the south of Israel. That's their permaculture teaching campus. Straw bale domes in the desert. And I have to put in, actually, this is the kibbutz I lived on for nearly 20 years. And I still go back there. I just had, you have to put in, like, your stuff. But kibbutz, we've heard a lot about kibbutz. I'm not going to talk anymore about it. Quick next slide. Oh, faster. Camp Hill, you've got to talk about Camp Hill as well. Now, I don't expect you to recognize these people. Amos Comenius, Ludwig Zinzendorf, Robert Owen. Camp Hill was started in 1939, 1940. These were the three inspirations for Camp Hill. I would like to say Camp Hill is flourishing today. and not just Camp Hill, because there's a whole lot of anthroposophically inspired places that work with people with special needs that don't call themselves Camp Hill, but I feel very comfortable going in there, like this place here. I feel very comfortable as an ex-Camp Hiller. Next slide. Now, yes, alternatives. Now we're today. This is what we're doing. This is from a couple of permaculture courses, and I usually teach permaculture and eco-village design more or less in the same sentence. We could talk a lot about that if we wanted to, but permaculture and eco-village design is definitely one thing. There are things that we are dealing with now. Next slide. Let's see, Findhorn. Can't not mention Findhorn, Circle of Light. We've probably, if you haven't come across Findhorn, go into their website or talk to somebody who has. Our last conference before that, 10 years ago, 9 years ago, was at Findhorn. Next, amazing community, 400 people, 1,000 people roundabout are influenced by it. And now I come to today. This is the IPCC 6th assessment report. Came out in February, March, something like that. This is from their front page. Some of us recognized it immediately. And this is from Findhorn. And actually, Albert, I know you're out there. I know you're out there, Albert. And it's a big thank you for you, to you for that. Sometimes I get a little bit moved. The gist of this whole thing is that climate change response has now come to see that alternative communities have some of the answers. I was going to read this to you, but I don't like reading off the board. But I highlighted some of the words there that I use when I teach eco-village design. They're all in there. This is what we can do. If we did eco-villages, it would solve the climate crisis. Another slide? Is there another slide? Yeah. We will hold hands. Not now, but across the world, we will solve this. I've got 10 minutes. Sorry I took so long, but 2,500 years is a long time. To do it in 15 minutes, 20 minutes is not bad. But 10 minutes. So I want to hear from you guys, what's wrong with my thesis? And I will note down what you say and hold it against you. No, I will take account of it. So the floor is open.
And I have to move around, so we'll move very quickly to what's wrong.
I just have a thought, Jan, from the other day. I can't remember what group I was in, but it was this. It was about upside down. Do you know when people come in and they just make the communities, but the people top down, exactly. So I think no matter what, it is the people's journey to make them work. Eco villages. So we can't just create all these villages. We have to have people's consciousness to follow, to fill out these villages.
Yep.
Who's next?
Yep. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for this provocative presentation. That reminds me on Franz from Assisi, who came to his ground in a fight, because first he had to find out that he wouldn't be a German like his father. He wanted to go his own way. And then he was in war for his small state, that he didn't want to be a part of the state. And then he also had difficulties with the church. So he didn't want either to go with the church. So he established his own community together with his friends. And then he built up a garden. And in that garden, they found the food, but a third of the garden they wouldn't cultivate, because that should be for the birds. And my point here is that you have to fight. You have to set with your consciousness. You have to set up the model. It's not just a gift you have. You have yourself to find the way, and then go together with other people. Yes.
Thank you. You were talking about Francis of Assisi. I don't know if you, which is very much in the monastic tradition, and you're absolutely right. He was rebelling against the given monastic tradition and started a new monastic thing called the Franciscans, who are alive and well and doing great things.
We've got a question online.
Yeah.
Are you going to read it? Yeah, Juan, you can go ahead.
Hi there. I'm Juan from Newton D. Campbell community. Yeah, my question is, because this sounds very beautiful and I actually believe in what you're saying, otherwise I wouldn't be here. But I sometimes wonder if, because of many of these communities, for example, Campbell, our main goal is not to be an eco-village, and so sometimes that goes not so hand in hand with what we do here. Like, for example, providing a great life for the people that we care for. And sometimes that's not very easy with being sustainable. So I don't know, I feel like maybe I'm just speaking from this community, but like the transition is not so easy. And then I don't know if it will count as much as like a community that like is doing that work of saving the world in sustainability. I don't know if I explain myself well. I just feel like in the work we make, sometimes we have to make concessions of sustainability in terms of heating, and we are making an effort to be more sustainable, but we do consume a lot of oil, gas, in a way that I don't feel like we are as sustainable as we should, but because we have to make concessions for what we do here, like we have homes really warm because of the people that we care for, or certain activities that we do. It's not so easy to control the way we consume, and then sometimes, yeah, what we do here doesn't go as hand in hand as with sustainability, even though we try to. I mean, that's partly my job here, but yeah, I don't know if I was too unclear.
Thank you, Juan. I think that's a really important thing. I'd like to ask the people here if they have responses to that.
We've got another question coming up. So do you want to keep the provocations going, or do you want to?
Provocation.
Well,
I'd like to hear if somebody has something to say to Juan's thing about not all communities today are 100% sustainable, and what is our response to that?
Does this link with your question, your comment?
First of all, I think it's never the question of 100%. It's the question of, are we on the path? With 100%, we will destroy our world also, I think. And the question, the provocation I have to you, Jan, is I don't think we need to save the world. We need to save ourselves, our own skins.
Yeah, thanks for that. I really
got time for probably one more before we need to transfer to the next. Some really interesting thoughts coming through here, and hopefully we'll link to the other two papers as well. Anyone else got some questions or comments on pieces?
I just wanted to say one sentence to Juan, and that is that permaculturalists and everybody else, I hope, we do what we can with what we have.
Yeah.
You wanted to say? Yeah, go for it. Go for it. It's called a discussion.
No, it's just to say that in our village, we do not want to be 100%. We want to interact with our local community. It's very, very important as part of our main thing. It's not to close off to the world.
That's great. I don't want to wrap things up too tightly, but in fairness to Jenny, we're going to move over to Jenny. Jenny's paper online now.
Okay.
And
Thank you.
And I think that, yes, thank you. Please thank you. And I do hope that we'll be able to have some minutes at the end of the 3 papers to come back to some of these common threads. We're all exhausted having covered so much history. 2,000 years is quite a gallop, isn't it? 2,500 years. So I'm going to introduce Jenny whilst we're making transition to virtual time. So I'm very delighted to be able to introduce Jenny Pickerill, Professor of Environmental Geography at Sheffield University. She's published on eco-houses, eco-communities, social justice and environmentalism. And she's currently completing a book on eco-communities surviving well together. So Jenny, if you want to take the floor now.
Thank you. That's a really hard act to follow, isn't it? And I feel I'm shifting scale quite a lot here. But just to start to say that I do think eco-communities can save the world, but I am really interested in who gets to be part of that. And so these questions are actually about that tension that one just raised between the ecological and the social. So I'm just going to share my slides. 2 seconds. Right. So yes, I thought I would just really briefly introduce myself. Thank you, Helen, for doing that. Just to say that I come at eco-communities from a history in environmental activism and anti-capitalist activism and eco-housing. So I'm kind of obsessed by the ecological, and I think that shapes some of the questions that I then ask, and perhaps blinds me to some of the other really important social and community aspects. And I've also always done participatory activist research, so working with the communities. So I've worked with some communities now in the UK for sort of 15 plus years. I want to start with a short story. I'm standing in a barn on a Welsh farm in Pembrokeshire, and I felt increasingly uncomfortable. I was facilitating the local consultation on a new eco-village being built next to Glandwell village. We had invited local residents to a presentation and a Q&A about the project, but things weren't going well. A woman from the audience was screaming at me that I was going to ruin her life. Turning the farm near her house into an eco-village would, in her mind, bring unwanted outsiders, dogs, cars and noise to the village. Lots of the stereotypes that Jan just mentioned as well. After the consultation, I received letters from locals arguing I was destroying Welsh rural life and its traditions. Locals seemed most upset by the potential to change their landscape view. They objected to the idea that homes would be visible from the other side of the valley and that the sheep farm would be no more. So this story is about a moment in the early years of Lammas, which is now an established eco-community in West Wales called Tir y Giffel. While the environmentalists argued that they were saving a degraded farm and building a climate resilient homes and livelihoods, locals were appalled at the very idea of such change. For local residents, planners and politicians, the proposal for a new eco-community was a worrying disruption of their village and their landscape. So I want to use this example to understand how the notion of the environment itself is disrupted and why it's so important that eco-communities are co-created in diverse places with diverse people, and how eco-communities are also co-created with the environment and the non-humans that already exist. In other words, part of the response and the resistance to Tir y Giffel was a belief that people should not live and build in greenfield rural areas. And I'm sure many of us have encountered that before. At the same time, those who wanted to build the community were deliberately seeking to repopulate the landscape and create a peopled environment. So they were re-envisaging both what the environment looked like and people's relationship to it. And to me, eco-communities offer an opportunity to explore what relating differently to the environment actually entails and its consequences. And it raises questions about who gets to determine what alternative environmental futures look like, and in that creation of eco-communities, who or whose views might be excluded. So in this sense, I'm also starting from a broader observation about the aesthetics of eco-communities, and a slight worry, a little niggle, that the similarity in how eco-community spaces look and feel across the world, thinking here specifically of how every eco-village kitchen seems to look the same wherever it is, might signal a lack of consideration of the diverse places and people from which they emerge. In other words, can eco-communities be a homogenizing force? And what are the consequences if they are? Or indeed, is that a bad thing at all? Or rather, is it possible to bring a broader range of people with us on this journey? So conceptually, my research starts from the point that the environment's always been shaped by humans, and especially in Britain, there's plenty of evidence illustrating how current landscapes have legacies of past clearances, agricultures, dams, pollutions, and more. So there's no notion of a pristine environment exists at all. But just because humans of the past have damaged the environment, of course, doesn't mean that humans of the future can't reconfigure their relations and improve environmental health, which to me is what a lot of eco-communities are doing. But crucially, I think that we need people on that environment to help the ways in which can coexist and flourish, which in Britain clashes with this notion of a rural space, which is quite people-free, or even the idea of wilderness. So if we take seriously not just the history of these society-environment relations in a place, but the ongoing cultural connections to environments and places, this requires new experiences in creating lived-in environments. And of course, eco-communities are at the cutting edge of those experiments in practicing different ways of creating peopled landscapes. But in doing that, they challenge that historical and cultural understanding of what an environment looks like. I've using the word eco-communities, I've heard all sorts of different words used this week in the conference, which is great to hear. And so just to say that I'm using quite a broad definition of eco-communities. And as we said, it doesn't include all intentional communities. It includes a range of different projects. And Tira Gaffel actually identifies as a low impact development, which again is a subset of another type of living intentionally. Just to say that, as I mentioned, I've been working with a range of communities for the last 15 years, but particularly I conducted research with 12 eco-communities in Britain, which is what I will draw on today. And I said I'd use interviews, observation, photography, but also over time, of course, I've become friends with these places and people. So it's quite interesting to be an academic, but also be very much in love with the idea of eco-communities. We all know this, but I just want to mention that when I say self-provisioning, these are the categories that I tend to use to say that eco-communities self-provision homes, livelihoods, infrastructures, production, and education. And of course, what's notable about all of these is that they're self-organized, generated collectively, and all concentrated in one place. So to me, it's the locally bounded concentration, which is the key defining feature of how eco-communities work. But also that is often the big challenge for existing ways of life. So I'm interested in how these practices of self-provisioning fundamentally shift how people relate to each other and to the environment, and whether they produce new environment, society, and social relations. I'm going to use two examples, one from Tira Gaffel and one from an urban community, Lilac, in Leeds. So first, Tira Gaffel, as I mentioned, is in Pembrokeshire, West Wales. It was established in 2009 and now has 9 small holdings living off-grid. It very much sought to disrupt the conventional understanding of productivist farming, moving towards intensive multi-crop production. They've diversified the landscape from a sheep farm to one populated with willow, fruit trees, vegetable patches, cows, geese, chickens and sheep. And they're trying to create a food and fuel rich landscape. Of course, permaculture is central to this, evidenced in how everything has multiple uses, closed loops of resource use, everything's interconnected. And for residents, it's this enlivening of biodiversity, which, as Hoppy says in this quote, the most important thing about this place is the increasing abundance of nature. I'm always amazed by the different insects and different birds, the little critters that I see. I'm just loving seeing that from the degraded landscape into one that's becoming really abundant, just multitudes of life as it's recovering, which I, like probably many of you, find really exciting. The great joy of working with places like Tirigafil for many years is I was able to be there right from the beginning. This is Hoppy and Tow's plot when it was a sheep farm, and this is how it looks now. So in terms of that re-enlivening and the shaping of the landscape in a very different way, I think this would be quite recognisable to many of you. So it's not just an ecological restoration project or even a classic smallholding, but it's driven by a desire to enable people to live off the land. So they're deliberately seeking to repopulate rural spaces and regenerate degraded environments, ecologically degraded environments, and creating an active lived-in landscape where humans coexist with nature. And it's based on this belief that the environment is more diverse, resilient, and abundant if people are close to it and directly reliant upon it. So the other thing is that Tirigafil is driven by a quest to open the countryside to as many people as possible, and affordability was a key part of this. So Tirigafil led the development of One Planet development in Wales, which has enabled other communities to set up and buy land at agricultural rates, which is obviously significantly cheaper, and therefore live off the land at quite a cheap rate. So the whole idea is that this is affordable and therefore open to all sorts of people. I think what's really interesting is Tirigafil is incredibly successful ecologically. And of course, it's in process, unfinished and experimental. And it has had some really unfortunate instances as well, like a major fire that took out one of the co-founders' homes. But of course, managing land using permaculture approaches and manual labour is hard work. And the pressures of this, along with complying with the One Planet development planning regulations, has ended up with a tendency to individualise. I think relating back to what Zeg talked about yesterday, there's a very similar pattern happening in Tirigafil. But also they didn't actually plan the social organisation. They were very focused on the ecological. And although they built a common house and said that they would make communal decisions, where we're at now is that the community is quite split and they've retreated very much to their plots to focus on their individual practices of provisioning. So looking at Tirigafil, yes, they've built new society environmental relations, but there's little evidence of new social relations. So rather they've disrupted conventional ways of relating to the environment, but maintained individualized social ways of interacting with each other, or unfortunately not interacting at all. So they've radically changed how the landscape looks and feels, not back to what it might have been, but very much a new version of a sustainable environment, but in many senses have forgotten or perhaps never prioritized enough the social element, which I'm really getting from this week at the conference, how that requires constant work. It can't be forgotten. Just a second example before I sum up. This is Lilac, a relatively new 20 household co-housing eco-community in West Leeds. It's a good example to explore how new social relations of sharing through their home design enables a reduction of environmental impact. So it's a dense urban development, and not surprisingly, homes have been designed to share common energy infrastructure, mains connection, photovoltaic panels, and a wastewater system. But residents also share a great deal, like gardens, bike sheds, laundry, car park, common house, spare rooms located in blocks, hallways. And even the sharing of the laundry because they have a contract preventing residents having their own washing machines. And they've enabled the individuals, therefore, to have smaller houses. So obviously the structural design of the site and homes reduce the overall environmental impact. This design, however, has also influenced lots of other positive daily practices of households. So residents share what jobs they like help with, or ask to borrow a piece of equipment. Alan describes there's a lot of efficiency of co-housing, of sharing errands. Frequently people say, I'm just nipping to the supermarket, does anyone want anything? Lots of efficiencies of time use and so energy as well. And with that, with informal and formal childcare, and also sharing of tools and resources of bikes and tools and tents and many things. So that makes life easier and can have a better standard of living, really, with better stuff, because we can share them and have a bit more time. And of course, this is what we hope co-housing and these sorts of eco-communities generate, so in being very successful. And in terms of accessibility and affordability, it has a particular approach, a solidaristic funding model, where the wealthier residents basically subsidise those well off. It's not income sharing, but all residents pay 35% of their annual income to live at Lilac, and therefore the overall costs are shared unevenly between the community. And Alan described this, that they'd done this because none of us wanted to live with just rich people. The thing that's missing from Lilac, which they acknowledge, is that they weren't able to build significant local relations with neighbours. Originally, they were going to open the gardens and playground to everyone, but actually they have built in quite a poor part of West Leeds, and they had a huge number of thefts when they set up. So they've now closed their gates. So while Lilac residents might argue they're showing what a sustainable lifestyle looks like, locals have been neither involved in the design or now not able to benefit from it either. So there were huge promises made to local people about access to this space that's now not possible. So just thinking what this means in terms of how we can understand what eco-communities are able to achieve in lots of positive ways, but also who might be missing. The first is, I think, it's clear that eco-communities do reconfigure environment-society relations by creating new forms of peopled landscapes, and that's a real positive to how we're going to save the world. But of course, there's ongoing risks of being exclusionary by being unaffordable. I try and work with projects that say they're affordable, but sometimes that unravels over time. They're often reliant on a high level of physical and mental health, and I've really enjoyed hearing the talks this week around disability and Camp Hill, something that I really need to educate myself about, but perhaps also those conversations better had with eco-communities. And see my concern about the erasure of a cultural history of existing landscapes by remaking the place anew. I think that eco-communities, certainly the ones in Britain, have failed to take into account how existing places were valued or loved by others, and to have perhaps more progressively sought to have taken them with them on that journey, or preserve some of those landscapes for that traditional approach. So I think that eco-communities must be obviously co-created, not just with the environment and the humans, but with the diverse people who are already in these places, and reflect this diversity and inclusion in how they operate, look and feel. So thank you very much. I've just produced a short comic called Living in an Eco-Community. It's available online, and I've also got hard copies, which, because I was hoping to come to Denmark, I would have brought with me, but I didn't make it. But I would absolutely love your feedback on that, because this also includes some of these questions. Thank you.
That's brilliant, Jenny. And we've got 10 minutes or so, 12 minutes or so for take direct questions. It's probably best to do it in this format as Jan had questions after. And we'll also take them, Joe will field them online. So should we start from questions in the room?
Hi, can you hear me online? Is that working all right? So I'm really sorry I missed the very first part of the talk, but I'm very interested in who's actually driving these communities and to what extent is developers trying to make money. Like we saw a long time with BedZ in London, and how that is changing with developers and different kind of formats, because I think getting into the construction sector, particularly in the UK, is going to be really important to try to change some of the ways that we can co-create the physical infrastructure and support social infrastructure, some of the communities that are being built in the future with all the plans for building. So I'm interested in sort of who designed those ideas. Was it the idea that came from a community first, working with a developer? Was it a developer had an idea to sell houses? How is this a model they're hoping to spread elsewhere, and are they learning from it? So how does this relate to the construction sector almost? Thanks.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So both of these were very much self-driven communities. To a Gaffel, absolutely, was a group of now residents who led it. In terms of Lilac, that was also a group that wanted to build an eco-village, but an urban eco-village. And only once they'd done the design did they approach a developer, Modcell, and they've got a new name now, better name. But basically the group self-managed the ideas and then employed a developer to build what they wanted. Then the developer has sought to replicate it, but not actually really managed to do that, because I don't think they realised the extent to which the group of residents that had led the project were vital to its success. So as far as I'm aware, that developer has not gone on and built a developer-led co-housing project. But so both of these projects were very much resident designed and pushed from the beginning. And in Lilac, there were some locals from Leeds, and in Tua Gaffel, most people were actually English. So again, it was immigration to set up a new community, and that did cause all sorts of tensions initially into a very Welsh village, a Welsh-speaking village. But as with most communities now, that community is now really well integrated, and most of the residents have learned Welsh. But they first came in, they were seen as outsiders. Hopefully that answers it.
That's great. Another question in the room. I think we're nothing else online in a moment.
Thank you. Tell me, how is it with your energy? Have you your own energy system?
So in Wales and Tua Gaffel, there was already hydropower. So that generates quite a lot of their energy. And then they have also installed small wind turbines and photovoltaic. I think even in mid Wales, it's quite hard to generate enough energy from renewable sources on that scale. So I wouldn't say that it's always warm. I think heat in Wales is a real problem. And in a different project, I've been exploring the compromises that's required. In Lilac, in Leeds, the urban community, they're connected to the national grid, but they also supplement it with photovoltaic power and just well insulated homes, but they do use mainstream electricity.
Great. I've got another question. Jan? No, nothing yet. So Jan, it's yours.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. We've talked about top-down and bottom-up development, but I'm a little interested in the regulatory and economic financial climate that either top-down or bottom-up works in. And I'm from Norway, and we have a regulatory climate there which is about as oppressive as our climate. It's frozen pretty much a lot of the year. And the economic climate is very much dominated by these sharks cruising off our alternative waters, waiting to get their teeth into juicy eco-village developments. So I wonder if you could say something about the regulatory and financial climate. Thank you.
That's a really interesting question, because when both of these communities were established, there was a lot of government support temporarily. Both of them benefited from government funds, hundreds of thousands of pounds that they both used to build their common house, and a reasonably supportive planning environment that understood what they were trying to do. That shifted in the last 10 years quite radically. And in fact, one of the problems at Pickerill was that with the kind of political shift away from supporting ecological projects, they ended up in court being heavily penalised for the way they built their homes because they had built their toilets outside. And that didn't fit with current building regulations. So when they started, they were in a supportive environment, and then that shifted. And now I would say there's very little support and very little subsidy and little support in planning. And as you say, Jan, huge pressure from corporate developers circling around the idea that they could do developer-led co-housing. And there is some of that developer-led co-housing. I think one of the more recent great examples is when co-housing groups like Ouch in London, which is an older women's co-housing group, worked with a local authority to protect themselves in effect from the profit-driven approach, but still get the institutional and building knowledge support they needed. So in that sense, I think that as far as I'm aware, we're in quite a difficult situation for setting up new eco-communities, but I don't think that corporate control has yet sort of flooded the market, but I might be wrong.
That's great. We're going to make space for one last, one last question, and then we're going to pass on to our third place.
Hi, Jenny. Thanks for your presentation. A question about the social dimension of sustainability. You mentioned that the community in Wales basically is experiencing a kind of a social breakdown because they didn't really plan around the social dimensions of sustainability. And I'm wondering if you're seeing that in some of the other communities that you're working with, and also what you might think would be helpful in those situations.
Yes, thank you. So firstly, yes, Pickerill, they focus too much on the ecological, on the living off the land. And actually, to be honest, if they had understood themselves more as an eco-village from the beginning, so they didn't call themselves an eco-village at the beginning, they now do. If they'd understood themselves more as an eco-village at the beginning, then I think they could have used all the resources from networks like Jen, and installed some of those social dimensions earlier. So I think that some of the co-founders just thought that would come naturally, and of course we know it doesn't, and of course we know that there's lots of processes to put in place to make them happen, and they're all out there, but they didn't seek to use them. In terms of, oh no, I've totally forgotten the second question now. Oh no, it was a really interesting question. I'm sorry, can you just repeat? Lessons
from the other communities. Lessons from are other communities experiencing the same, and what might be the solution or response?
That was it. Less so at Lilac, and less so, for example, Lancaster Co-housing. What they've experienced socially is very familiar to many people, which is that the co-founders, the pioneers, have struggled to integrate once it's been set up. So at Lancaster Co-housing, the pioneer actually left the project once it was established. At Lilac, one of the pioneers, Paul Chatterton, who's often identified with the project, has had to purposely step back and is trying to no longer be involved in the kind of social governance of the project, because I think there's a real tension. When you're a pioneer, you push through, you get it done, and perhaps you get impatient with some of the democratic processes. And he's stepped back at Lilac, and that space has been filled by the other members. And so they've managed to develop what their social relations they want it to be, now, all of them together, in a way that perhaps Paul said he didn't feel he was able to do because he was the one setting it up. So I think they've managed to self-organize and self-take them to the next stage of far better working together. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Jenny. We're going to draw to a close there and thank for Jenny in the usual way. Two really good great papers so far, and we're going to move on to Amsale Temesgen, who I think there'll be some synergies again. And again, you've got 30 minutes. Amsale, I'm sure will introduce herself, but you're associate professor at Nord University, and the focus here is on ecological economics and worked at the working at the intersections between well-being and sustainability in grassroots initiatives. So I'm going to make sure that tech's all on. And we'll have questions.
Maybe co-host to share screen. Because I'm just participating.
Right. Yeah. And there will be time for questions at the end of Amsale's presentation, and hopefully a little bit of time to draw the threads too. Okay.
Perfect.
Thanks. Take it away.
Yes, thank you. Right. There. Yes. Thank you, Helen. Yes, my name is Amsale, and I'm from Nord University in Norway, from the Center of Ecological Economics and Ethics. And today I would like to present a paper that I wrote a couple of years ago that is never been presented in any conference before, thanks to the pandemic. So this is a first chance to share it and get feedback, and hopefully I'm not too rusty. These things need practice, but just bear with me. And so we start with, here you see, eco-villages and looking at them as grassroots innovations. So innovations, lifestyle movements, living labs, and green niches are labels that are used for them to indicate that there is innovations to change lifestyles, practices, and finding solutions to respond to the local situations, and possibly using also greener technologies. So with these local action, the aim is to change practices and lifestyles, and this paper is looking at how that happens. And when they succeed, what are the things that are in place? And when they are experiencing challenges, where is it that they meet hindrances or problems? And for this, I used something called social practice theory. So this presentation might be a little bit theoretical, as kind of, so it gives a good balance maybe with the practical approaches, for example, that Jan presented earlier. So social practice theory is a theory from the field of sociology. And it is a theory that finds itself in the middle of two camps. The theories that focus on the agency of the individual vis-a-vis those theories that look at the structures. So agency says that the agent or the person has almost full autonomy to decide how they act. So theories that have this understanding would recommend, for example, awareness raising or price adjustments and so on, saying that if we adjust prices with taxes or incentives, then a person would change the way they behave. So they ignore all the other contexts that also influence. Sorry. Maybe I should put her away. Maybe you let me know. Siri is very eager and wants to join the conversation. Okay. Hopefully they have gotten some of that. So yes, so I was talking about the agent focus theories, focusing on the or highlighting the role of the individual. So the others focus on structures, norms, values, traditions that influence individuals to behave in a certain way. So social practice theory positions itself in the middle of these two camps and say we have autonomy, but at the same time we're strongly influenced by social structures. And they have a definition of practice that focuses on different elements that influence the way we act. Material, for example, technologies, the values that we have, and also the skills and competences. There are three elements that influence how we behave. For example, if we decide to bicycle to work every day, that would be a practice. Practice is something that we do regularly, not something that we just start and stop. So if we do decide to bike to work every day, then we need the value, for example, the belief that our biking to work has meaning, contributes to making a change. So there has to be some value anchoring of this practice that we do. We need to also know how to bike. So that's also the competence part of it. And we need the bike itself. So this is the theory's framing of how we behave on an everyday basis, is by combining that values, competence, and materials come together to support that practice. And it's the combination of practices that we call lifestyles. So they use concepts such as bundles and complexes. So when we have bicycling as one routine and maybe growing our own food or being vegetarians, then these different practices draw on similar value systems, similar skill sets, and possibly similar also materials. So when practices draw on the same type of elements, then they become strong and cohesive, and then they form lifestyle. They determine the friends we make, the communities we create, and so on. So these then lifestyles will be consisting of routines and habits and practices that will be normal to us. And when we, like in Ecovillages, developed communities or groups that believe the same way and behave the same way, then we have these communities of practice. So for this presentation, then the Ecovillage, I understood Ecovillage as a community of practice where people do these things together. They have their own gardens, they have sustainable housings, and so on. But in the larger theory, communities of practice doesn't have to be place-based. It could be a group of engineers, for example, that are keen on certain way of doing things. But right now we will look at communities of practice as place-based areas that develop and propagate new practices. And these practices are, as I said, sustainable modes of transport, new patterns of consumption, for example, sharing practices and the like that we associate eco-villages to be doing. So with these theoretical grounding, then I can present this long research question that was guiding the research paper. And how the question is, how does the choice of developing the infrastructure needed for a sustainable lifestyle promote or limit the development of the necessary competence and meaning for such a lifestyle? If you remember this picture that I presented, where we have practices at the center and we have competence, values, and material, the question asks, when you tinkle or change the material, how do the others change so that your practice either grows and thrives and you become, you learn new practices, or it starts to, maybe weaken. So that's the question. For this, then I had Hurdal Ecovillage in Norway and Finnhorn as case studies. Briefly, Hurdal is an eco-village that is an hour's drive north of Oslo. It has had two phases of development. The early phase, where a group of idealists moved to the eco-village, established a cooperative and bought a farm and built their own houses from natural materials, straw bale houses. They then had an ambition of growing and expanding and developed a zoning plan. But then they realized that it is not easy to try to build your own home. It takes time. It requires skills. So some of the houses had structural problems, and it's costly. So they ended up with debt, and that forced them to sell their land to a developer, Filago, in 2012 and 13. And Filago built these houses that you see. They are module-based housing. They imported the building materials from Eastern Europe, and then they were set up in Norway. They have solar panels complementing their energy needs, but otherwise they are connected to the grid and the water system and the sewage system of the municipality. By 2014-16, then 66 families had moved in. But the process of growing to this scale caused economic and technical problems for the developer, which ended up with a lot of conflict, and the investor Filago was bankrupt in 2019. So now a new investor has bought the place, but the time that my study covered was a period of intense insecurity, because they didn't know whether they were going to lose, their farm, and they're just going to turn into a neighborhood. So that is the part that I'm covering. That is the time period. So this is how it looks right now. This is the first cluster that Filago built. It had aimed to build 3 clusters, but they didn't manage to build the 2 before they got bankrupt. Finnhorn, that is a very popular eco-village. Jan mentioned it, 400 residents. It was established in 1962 and had 3 phases of development. The first couple of decades where they were getting established started out with a caravan. Anybody that doesn't know about Finnhorn, should I quickly go through? You don't? Okay. Yeah, okay, great. So it's almost, I think, the oldest eco-village maybe in Europe. It's one of the largest. So they started out with 3 adults moving into a caravan, and started to grow their own food, but ended up attracting a lot of innovative and industrious people to the eco-village, and ended up growing to the size that they are today. So this first decades is when they went from a very small community to being to having big infrastructure, foundation, the park, Clooney Hill College that used to be a hotel. They grew in physically. From the 80s to 2000s, then the eco-village concept started to gain prominence. I think it started in Finnhorn at a conference where they first named it the Planetary Village. And I think this is the Field of Dreams, if I remember correctly, where they had 30 houses that they built. From the 2000s to now, they have built additional 2 clusters of housing, and they are probably now in the process. They were waiting for the pandemic to be over to build the 3rd cluster. This is the picture that Jan showed. This is one of the newer clusters of housing that they have built. So quickly, the methods were qualitative interviews, 15 in Hurdal and 14 in Finnhorn. Participatory observation. So I was part of the course in Finnhorn called experience week, took part in an introductory eco-village design course, was part of internal meetings and common activities. And also I did content analysis of reports, articles, documentaries, films, and basically the resources I could find online. So what are the findings? So I was looking at the material expansion in these two eco-villages. Both of them had grown in this in the time from their establishment to today. So material has grown, but how has it affected their values and how has it affected their competence is what I was looking to find in the data. So how is Findhorn growing new values? It is through practices they call attunement, for example, deep inner listening and manifesting their intuition into reality. And they also have educational programs and workshops where they develop the skills that they need for communal and common activities. So one of the central people in Findhorn said the following to show how spirituality inspired their material expansion. He says, spirituality is the community glue that keeps people together. The eco-village is an expansion of the spiritual side of it. So it made sense for the community to build up the wind park. It ultimately is about how to take that and make it into love in action, which is the co-housing or what you experience in the foundation. So this is how he shows that the values influenced what they built and how they built it. They looked at these processes of erecting these infrastructures as love in action. And that is a very common language in Findhorn. And this is from Hurdal. This is one of the founders. And he was showing how he had to manage the value systems in different worlds when he was in the initial stages of building the eco-village. He says, I have also gradually come to a kind of demanding position because when you start to involve companies and banks and eventually also investors, it becomes in a way, I have to build a lot of bridges between a commercial capitalist world and an idealistic world, which is where I come from, and then try to find a balance. And then you have to create enthusiasm for it and constantly try to keep a momentum. That has in a way been my life for 20 years. So he is an optimist that these different worlds can come together and build a community. So that that was his optimism, and we can see here the skepticism of one of the inhabitants of Hurdal. And she says, I mean, there is a difference between people here, but I do not live in this house because I think the house is so nice. I came to the eco-village to live down there in the straw bale houses, and I could have stayed there. For me, the house here does not represent me. I do not want smart house solutions. I would have liked a compost toilet. I would have liked to have had all those things, but it was in a way, the eco-village became a package. So either you bought the house here or not. So this person then wakes up every day, looks the house, and she's like, this is not me, but this is the package I live in. So yeah, and you can see some of this as provocations to some of the ideas. So this is then, you can see the undercurrent of a conflict, right? A person that faces identity crisis when she sees her house will eventually come into a conflict with some others. So we can see the material expansion and competence relationship in Findhorn when they built these newer houses. So just a background, in Findhorn it's very interesting because they have some of the clusters that they built with their social idealism in mind. But then that pushed them into economic crisis. So then in the next cluster, they went to the other side It's like, now we need to pay down our debt. Now we need to make sure this is financially viable. And they didn't have space for the social thing. So then the rich people came, and then the social side will start to struggle. So you can hear it here. Okay. All right, then I'll just continue. Okay, this is interesting. So in glib terms, he says, the bigger the person's house, the less interest they had in a common facility with a washing machine in it. They got 4 bedrooms and 2 washing machines. What the hell do they need with a common facility for? Whereas, people in affordable housing were much more attached to it. So as an experiment, that didn't work either. The place is now up for sale. Maybe in 10 years' time, people will be complaining bitterly about the fact that there are no more of these facilities. So this is then one of the tension between the economic side on one side and then the idealism kind of pulling in different directions. So one more, and then I'll move to the discussion or the lessons. So in Hurdal, one person says, we lack informal meeting places that may actually help us to discover that we can resolve these conflicts and contradictions, that we may realize that we actually do not have very different interests, because I think maybe we attribute to others some qualities that they do not necessarily have. I think maybe people would recognize they have much in common. So you see, having a meeting place can help people to come together, talk to each other, and develop skills of communication, conflict resolution. So when they miss that, then they're in their homes being maybe frustrated with each other and not having a place to sit down, actually relate. So just summing up, both eco-villages started with a focus on idealism and spirituality. They started with simpler material basis and ended up expanding. With growth, economic challenges came. They chose different challenges. One went with an investor, one solution. The other chose different ways, community financing and various strategies, and which helped them to survive, to build several clusters and gather new lessons, while the investor in Hurdal got bankrupt. So both dropped introductory courses to attract new residents, which means that the reaffirmation of values and the skills that they could have gotten through these introductory courses eventually was not there. And this may endanger their role as communities of practice. So finally, the lessons learned is that these different elements or practices influence each other. They are interdependent. So when we change one, we should kind of expect almost a domino effect that the others will follow. And it requires some consideration when eco-villages or communities start to change the material basis that a consequence might come. So this is the main message that I thought to pass on. This is the article if you want to read more in depth. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, and that's perfect timing. And I've read the article; it's really, really interesting. So I would recommend it. In fairness, in terms of everyone speaking, we've got 10 minutes or so for questions specifically for Amsale, and then we've got about 5 minutes to draw some threads across, if there are any, between the 3 fascinating papers. So we did have a comment. I think this is just a technical point. The oldest still running eco-village in Europe is Solheima in Iceland, 1930. So we're all learning here, right?
Yes,
so
thank you.
Well, let's move on to questions. I'll start in the room, in real world. So who's got a question from? No, yes.
Yes. Thank you, Amsale. That was really interesting. So I was wondering if you were able to get a sense with these case studies, if there's a limit to how radical material changes can be before people kind of push back, and if there's maybe gradual material changes that can be introduced that will change behavior, kind of like the frog in boiling water where they don't really notice what's going on around them, and if something is too extreme, if you found people kind of rebelling and pushing back.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe people that have a longer experience with intentional communities can have more personal, insights about this. My study is limited because I came at one time and then saw them and the context at that time. So I could have followed them over time and seen what happens. But my observation is when you are radical, you can either struggle with having enough interest to sustain your practice, and usually eco-villages are to some extent dependent on growing to remain viable and attractive and ensure survival. But when you do that, then you need economic resources, and then you also come maybe in conflict with local authorities that want you to build your houses in a different way and so on. So it's maybe the nature of the change of these communities that you will meet one of them, either the financial challenge or the regulation challenge. So you can't have that kind of isolated, just looking at the people, like how radical are you before you become too much for that individual. So this is what I can think of right now. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Great. Oh, yes. Consistent. Question for each.
In some degree, I guess all eco-villages want to be independent. But with the energy crisis, there will be, I guess, much focus on this independency. Can you, from your research, say something about how much focus there could be in eco-villages on these issues about independency on energy?
So whether they are independent, that was very important for Findhorn, and I think Findhorn is completely independent. The houses generate energy for heating purposes from their solar panels, and then the wind part, the windmills provide the rest of their energy needs. And this is something that they are very proud of. And I didn't put up more quotes, but there were material that showed how that is very important in also their community glue. It's like a cohesion to work together. You have a common project, and with energy, with the way the energy demands are becoming more expensive, it also brings in additional urgent needs. But at the time of the study, it was important both to be independent and also to have something together to maintain and care for. In Hurdal, they were not entirely independent, and that is something that some of the study participants saw as a weakness. So it's an important aspect.
Are there any questions online? Not yet. Okay. Yes.
Oops, sorry. Thank you. I really enjoyed that talk, and obviously I know Findhorn better than I know Hurdal, but I really enjoyed your framework. I really liked the way that you set it up. So you did an empirical context within some of these sort of quite big theories. I'm interested particularly in competences. And so I know you were focusing mostly on how the material influenced what happened. And you talked quite a lot about the material and the meanings, or the material and the values. But I wonder whether there was more about the competencies that came in. For example, in the last talk, we were talking a little bit about the capacity for decision making, which I know Findhorn have worked really, really hard on. the sort of the social infrastructures and how to pull some of those things together, for example, as well as some of the physical competencies. So I just wondered if you could comment on how you saw the competencies influence the materials and the meanings and the outcomes in your communities.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, in Finnhorn, I just briefly touched on it, but to remain within the time frame, I couldn't include everything, so I just highlighted the challenges that could kind of relay my message. But the Finnhorn, through educational programs and workshops, they actively cultivate the skills, like you said, the decision making, conflict resolution, and when they need help from outside, especially with conflict resolution, it helps when there are outside mediators than inside. So they bring in where they need help, and then through that, they also develop the skills inside for social interaction. And the way one of the comment was saying how the spirituality inspired the practices, the wind park and the housing. You could also see that feeding back, right? When you see the material results of your values, and then you go back and say, this is what we achieved, so how did we get there? And then you develop the competencies that enabled you to get there. So there's that kind of active maintenance of competences.
Yeah, we've got Jenny wants to enter into the discussion here. Jenny, you unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. It's a response to Amy's question, but also building on Amsale's great talk, which I love. Thank you. And it's about the kind of boredom and manual requirements of some of these practices. And it's just that some of the communities I've been working in Britain, they've found that after a while, if those practices are too onerous, too physical, that they fail, and that they start to seek gradually more comfort. So when I've been working in one community that's not legal, so I just call it Green Hills so that no one can find it. And when I asked some of the women what they really wanted, they said, oh, you know, I'd just really like a washing machine. I'd just really like a cooker. I'd really like a tap that had hot water coming out of it. We've built this super radical, super green lifestyle, and it's hard work. And I'm really looking forward to a time when I don't have to work this hard. So I think there's a really interesting tension that Amy's raised, which is, when do these new social practices get sustained? And when do they become too radical that actually they fail, that it's actually too much work? And the same, Tinker's Bubble is a community in Somerset that doesn't use fossil fuels. And likewise, they've got quite a high turnover of people, because living without fossil fuels is very admirable and great, really hard work, and people get physically burnt out by it. So I think, you know, it's a kind of intellectual comment and question about, when do we know if these new practices are actually sustainable, or rather, what makes them sustainable? Is it collective encouragement? Is it those communities of practice? And are they failing because people are feeling like they're on their own? Or is there something else that we need to understand in how that gets sustained? So it's not really a question. Sorry, I've done a classic academic comment, but thank you.
No, that's really useful. And I think this is a really good juncture. We've got literally 5 minutes left to pull together any threads or thoughts that of the accumulated wisdom from these three papers. You know, going back maybe to Jan's idea of, you know, are eco-villages the solution to saving the world, and where are the gaps maybe in terms of where we need further research and further thinking? Are there any, I hope I haven't made too ambitious scope there. Thoughts in the room first? Is there anything on? No? Jan, yeah, go.
Nobody else wants to talk. I'll fill the silence. I really like this thing about, you know, practices, these three things: meaning and materials and competence. And actually, I'm going to work on that. I'm talk to you about that later. But there are two images that come to my mind about community. The first is that we have definitely the material component, which is a bunch of houses, and we may have a lot of competence in there, but actually a community is a spiritual thing as far as I'm concerned, and that is where the meaning comes in. And we all know that, you know, there's a difference between a group of people who are working together with meaning and a group of people, you know, standing at a bus stop. And the other thing is that every community is a unique individual. It's a unique incarnation of a community spirit, and it has its biography. And I think that's, for me, that has been such a powerful discovery, that you look at a community and there are patterns of behavior, but each one is its own unique individual story. And I think comparing them is really, really powerful, but bearing in mind that you're actually dealing with an individual. So that wasn't a question, maybe it was a comment, but it was something that was in me that I wanted to say.
But if I'm correct, it's a good segue into your workshop on storytelling. Oh. I didn't miss that. Yes. Are there any other we've got final thoughts, quick questions? I didn't get you to stand up in the middle time, so I've lost your energy, and I forgot to do the interpretive dance or whatever it was supposed to do. And you sang before this, so should we close at this point and thank all three speakers, and also thank our wonderful tech team, Joe, Amy, and our room tech. But thank you mostly to Jan, Jenny, and Amsale. And thanks to everyone joining us online. That's great.